Anti-Masonry. Any Masons in here? In this period of great prosperity, there was a concern that somehow it wasn't a level playing field. That, you know, I'm exaggerating here, but we've all heard the 1% remark of late. Sort of like that. That maybe there was, maybe not the Dan Brown version of Masons, but certainly the elites of most communities had a Masonic lodge, which was entirely justified because it was a way for people from diverse backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, to get together and kind of decide what's going on, because, say, here in Port Byron, there was no formal government per se. Port Byron did have one of the first lodges locally. What happens is, in 1826, William Morgan steps away from being a Mason and gets into an argument and is going to publish all the Masonic secrets.
Oh.
Well, the consensus is that they murdered him. They never find the body.
Oh my gosh.
And the suspicion is that he, to this day, is somewhere just off the bank of Fort Niagara, in Lake Ontario. It causes a huge uproar because it touched all the right chords. Communities just flare up in opposition to this secret order that was somehow controlling the economy. Churches divide. You know, ministers were often Masons because they were leaders in the community, and it just takes the rug out from everybody and mixes everything up. I could do a whole program just on this. As things settle down, the anti-Masonry group, you know, kind of morphs in or merges into what sort of becomes the Republican Party. Okay?
Really?
But it takes that kind of oomph to reshuffle the deck, if you will, in the 1830s. I am really doing this in a cursory fashion. So, slavery and abolitionism. Certainly you know about Frederick Douglass and all of that in this area. And this part of central New York was incredibly important to abolitionism. I mean, you only have to go to Harriet Tubman. Okay, I'll just set that aside. That's a story we could also tell. Slavery, though, I'd like to dwell a little bit on, because it's important to remember slavery was very much a part of this community. I mentioned Higley earlier, Seth Higley and Enos. Seth had slaves. So in 1820, slavery here is abolished in 1826, but in 1820, Seth Higley at his mill had slaves. Okay, so a canal boat going through that lock was likely to see African Americans in slavery working at the mill, which is kind of different than what you would think. I showed you the receipt there to Mr. Payne earlier. The Payne family also owned slaves. So that happened here. It's a little different than what you would think. In Cuyahoga County generally, especially in Auburn prior to 1820, there has always been a big African American population. There was also a very big slave population. So we abolished slavery by 1826 in a very gradual way. I mean, it ends in 1826, begins in the 1790s. So that would have been a big difference here. I mean, in 1820, Port Byron has slaves. In 1830, there's still a very vibrant free black community. So, an example, William Hazard. in the 1855 census. He's one of several in this community in Mentz. Black, he, with his family, and he's a boatman on the Erie Canal. Indeed, I found a great many African Americans from the 1855 census as boatmen on the canal. Spiritualism. Have you ever heard of the Fox sisters?
Oh, yeah, north.
Okay.
North.
Yes, very good. Very close to home. Just briefly, because actually that turns out to be a fraud. Fox sisters. They, cracking knuckles or whatever they did, and I don't know whether they did it intentionally or they just became, in a sense, a victim of their own success. They somehow were cast as being able to speak to the spirit world. And it became incredibly important. The sense of spiritualism, that you could communicate with more than next door, becomes very prevalent in this area and among a very educated class. So the Fox sisters really get the ball going, but if you were here in 1850, spiritualism, if your neighbor said he was talking to his dead grandmother, you wouldn't have thought that unusual. Okay? Speaking of unusual, Millerites. The second coming, if you will, was supposed to happen on that day. The end of the world in some people's minds. William Miller, who's not from this area, though in 1844 he actually is here in Port Byron doing a revival as part of an upstate tour, proclaiming that on that day, whatever, October, the world was something was gonna happen. Somebody was gonna come down from the clouds, or there was gonna be the giant rapture, and people very much believed this. People sold their homes, people bought white gowns, people went to the mountaintops. They did it once, they did it twice. Third time, which was the October 1844 date, people are beginning to go, maybe we made a mistake. You can't fault them, though. Again, the sense of society was that things were really getting better. Okay, government was working, society had all these rough edges, but we were headed toward the millennium. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Obviously, if you were a woman or an African American or a Native American, not so good. But there was this sense of perfectionism. How could the millennium not be too much further away? Does that make sense? Okay. So here in Port Byron in 1844, there were people who actually, and I don't mean this in a critical way, I mean, we went through something like this not too many years ago. Somebody said the end of the world was coming. It happens. What I'm trying to say is that there's the mindset, there's the cultural setting that makes that type of belief possible. Oh, okay. Talking about perfectionism, Sabbatarianism. So government's doing really well, except it's offending God. Okay? It's keeping the canal open on Sundays. Okay? Business, I mean, we still have blue laws, right? I think now we can buy liquor after 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock? Okay, but I still see the ice cream shops opening before noon. So that's my criteria. Okay, so as soon as the canal opens, and this goes into other areas as well, but the government was an immediate target. because the canal operated 24 hours a day, 24/7. People went, oh my God, literally, how could we offend God by working on Sundays? In my own family, when I read diaries from the 1940s, Sundays, I take that back. In my life, Sundays were a day where you stayed at home peacefully. Is that true? Okay. So the state received countless petitions from people demanding that the canal close down. Well, the state's making a lot of money from the canal, so I'm not saying that they're biased, but they do come up with a statement. They actually form a committee. The legislators get together and form a committee. I won't say too much about that, but they come up with a statement which really explains the situation. The boats, I'll just read their conclusion. The boats on the canals are numerous, and should the locks be closed, like the lock up by the Erie House, or the ditch lock, should be closed on the Sabbath, vast numbers would throng the canal above and below, and many persons from on board would resort to the taverns, grog shops, and houses of ill fame that would soon abound in the vicinity of the locks. I guess that would be a bad thing. And most of the vices which degrade and debase mankind would no doubt be increased to a much greater extent than if the boats were permitted to pass on Sundays. So that doesn't end the debate. It goes on for decades. It goes on to today. But the state maintains that the canal is going to go through going to stay operating on Sundays. You wouldn't want all that canal riffraff to hang out at the National Hotel in the village. Okay. But the legacy of that carries on. Okay.